In today's video, we examine the worst wedding deaths ever recorded. From a bride walking through a tunnel while wearing a synthetic lace gown with a 4-foot train, to a wedding minister officiating a desert ceremony in 105-degree heat after a 3-hour drive. It was June 18, 2017, in Napa Valley, California. Morning light sat low over the terraced vines, and the air was still enough for helicopters to hover without drift. The plan looked simple from the ground. Nothing about the setting suggested that a controlled celebration was about to become a fatal mechanical failure. Evan and Marissa Carlisle were a wealthy Napa Valley couple. Evan, 41, built his fortune investing in software infrastructure tied to cloud storage and aerial data, and he fixated on clean, stable overhead imagery that looked effortless and controlled. Marissa, 38, was a former event planner pregnant with their first child. She treated the gender reveal as her final professional project, managing every detail herself. She passed on licensed aviation effects teams, not because of cost, but because their protocols slowed decisions and limited her control. The reveal was scheduled for late morning to catch even light across the vineyards before the heat distorted the air. A private helicopter was hired to hover just above the terraced rows, while colored powder marked the moment on camera. Guests waited below with phones raised. The pilot held a low, steady hover to frame the shot. From the ground, everything appeared calm, precise, and rehearsed. Another controlled display meant to last only seconds. The helicopter arrived mid-morning, a light utility model commonly used for vineyard surveys and aerial inspections. It settled into position above the stone terraces. A powder release basket had been clamped to the skid frame earlier that morning by a small subcontractor Evan had sourced online. During the final check, the pilot warned that the powder could behave unpredictably in rotor wash and recommended releasing it during slow forward motion. Marissa declined, insisting the aircraft remain stationary to keep the shot clean. Finely milled cornstarch mixed with powdered pink dye was loaded into the basket. The vineyard's security cameras were active, recording for insurance documentation. Friends and staff watched from a distance, phones raised. The aircraft was hovering just above the upper terrace level, with stone retaining walls rising unevenly along the slope beneath it. The pilot repeated his concern. The release mechanism was armed anyway. When the powder was released, it did not fall. The rotor wash pulled it upward in a dense cloud. The rotor wash pulled the powder upward into the aircraft's disturbed airflow, disrupting stability around the tail boom. Within seconds, the helicopter yawed sharply to the right. The pilot attempted a correction, but directional control deteriorated rapidly as the tail rotor lost effective authority. The nose dipped as the aircraft began an uncontrolled spin. The tail boom clipped a stone retaining wall lining the terrace. The impact twisted the frame and pitched the helicopter forward. It slammed nose first into the vineyard slope. The front cabin collapsed inward. Evan's head snapped forward and to the side, breaking his neck instantly. Marissa was driven into the instrument panel as the seat rail failed, crushing her chest and abdomen. Fuel ruptured along the underside of the aircraft but did not ignite. Dust and powder hung briefly in the air. The helicopter settled at an angle, rotor blades shattering against stone. The unborn child did not survive the impact. Vineyard staff began running uphill. One worker called emergency services within 30 seconds. Paramedics arrived 11 minutes later. The pilot survived with fractures and was able to describe the loss of control. Security footage captured the yaw, the strike, and the final impact from 2 angles. Investigators recovered tail rotor fragments coated with pink powder residue. Flight data confirmed a sudden imbalance and loss of directional control immediately after release. The coroner reported Evan died instantly from a broken neck and brainstem injury. Marissa suffered massive internal bleeding, crushed lungs, and ruptured organs. Death occurred within minutes due to blunt force trauma. The fetus showed no signs of survivability after maternal injury. The final report cited unauthorized aerial modifications and disregard of pilot warnings. Marissa's planning notebooks were logged as evidence. Pages showed safety notes crossed out and replaced with instructions emphasizing stillness, framing, and timing. The helicopter never caught fire. It simply stopped responding. And when control disappears in the air, the ground doesn't forgive mistakes. It was May 21, 2016, along the Wilmington River waterfront in Savannah, Georgia. Humid air clung to a weathered wooden pier, extending into brackish water as the afternoon temperature reached 84 degrees. Light clouds drifted overhead, offering brief relief from the coastal heat. Arthur Moss, 62, stood adjusting his navy blue suit jacket near the pier's entrance. The retired dock supervisor carried himself with the rigid posture of a man who had spent 4 decades enforcing safety protocols at the port. His weathered hands, scarred from years of handling cargo equipment, smoothed his tie as he watched venue staff make final preparations. Arthur's practical nature had made him question the pier's suitability months earlier, but his daughter's vision for a waterfront ceremony had prevailed. The bride, his 29-year-old daughter who worked as an event planner in Atlanta, had selected this historic pier for its romantic appeal. She had dismissed Arthur's concerns about the structure's age and condition, citing the venue's popularity for weddings. The pier had been flagged by city inspectors for load restrictions earlier that spring, though it remained open for limited use. Temporary plywood panels had been installed along the central walkway to create a wider aisle for the procession. The seasonal workers who installed them lacked structural engineering expertise. No professional had evaluated whether the modifications compromised the pier's integrity. The original wooden planking showed visible gaps where salt water had corroded the underlying support beams. 140 guests filled white folding chairs arranged in rows along both sides of the extended aisle. A handheld camera operated by the bride's cousin captured footage from the front row, while a hired drone pilot positioned his aircraft 50 feet overhead for aerial shots. The ceremony was scheduled to begin at 4:30 p.m. Arthur took his daughter's arm as the string quartet began the processional music. The guests rose simultaneously from their chairs, introducing dynamic loading and vibration across the pier's central span that stressed already corroded connections. The sudden shift in distribution stressed the corroded bolt connections beneath the central span. As father and daughter stepped onto the modified aisle, the drone footage captured the procession from above. Arthur's measured pace reflected his awareness of the pier's age, though he showed no visible concern. They had walked approximately 30 feet when corroded bolt connections at the pier's midpoint failed in rapid succession under combined dynamic load. The central section of the aisle collapsed inward without warning. Arthur fell 18 feet through the broken planking onto a mixture of exposed timber supports and concrete footings below. The initial impact caused multiple rib fractures and bilateral lung collapse. Secondary debris, including collapsing structural timbers, caused catastrophic pelvic trauma and massive uncontrolled hemorrhaging. The drone's overhead footage showed the collapsed section of the pier and a motionless figure beneath broken planks, partially obscured by splintered wood and twisted metal brackets. His daughter had been thrown clear of the collapse zone and suffered only minor abrasions. Emergency responders arrived within 9 minutes of the initial 911 call. Paramedics descended into the debris field, but found no vital signs. Arthur was pronounced dead at 4:47 p.m. from blunt force trauma and massive internal hemorrhage. The wedding ceremony was immediately terminated. Guests were evacuated from the remaining sections of the pier, while a blue tarp was positioned over the collapse site. The drone footage was secured by investigators as part of the official inquiry. The subsequent investigation concluded that the pier's load capacity had been significantly exceeded during the ceremony, accelerating the structural failure. The temporary plywood modifications had created additional stress points that accelerated the failure of already compromised connections. No structural engineer had approved the aisle extension. Arthur Moss died beneath the temporary aisle during the wedding ceremony. Investigators later confirmed the collapse was caused by excessive loading on a structurally compromised pier. It was July 23, 2018, when a summer wedding celebration in Mesa, Arizona, became the scene of an unthinkable tragedy involving a forgotten child. The suburban church parking lot stretched across 2 acres of black asphalt, with temperatures soaring to 107 degrees Fahrenheit under the relentless desert sun. Heat waves shimmered off the pavement as wedding guests hurried between their air-conditioned vehicles and the church's cool interior. Jasper Holt, 4 years old, had been selected as the ring bearer for his aunt's wedding ceremony. The preschooler possessed the typical energy and curiosity of a child his age, but also displayed an unusual compliance when given instructions by adults. His parents, who worked in the healthcare industry, had driven 3 hours from Phoenix that morning to attend the ceremony. Jasper had fallen asleep in his car seat during the final 30 minutes of the journey, exhausted from the early morning departure. The wedding was scheduled to begin at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, with the ceremony expected to last approximately 1 hour, followed by photographs and a brief reception in the church hall. Family members had arrived throughout the morning, with many choosing to leave their vehicles in the parking lot's outer sections to avoid the intense heat radiating from the asphalt closest to the building. When Jasper's family arrived at the church, the child remained deeply asleep in his child safety seat, positioned behind the driver's seat where he was not immediately visible. His father, rushing to help with last-minute ceremony preparations, made the decision to leave Jasper sleeping in the climate-controlled vehicle rather than wake him and deal with a potentially cranky child during the important ceremony. The car was parked in a section of the lot that received full sun exposure throughout the afternoon. All windows remained closed to maintain the air conditioning, and the vehicle's dark interior absorbed heat rapidly once the engine was turned off. The outside temperature continued climbing as the afternoon progressed, reaching 109 degrees by mid-ceremony. Inside the sealed vehicle, temperatures rose rapidly after the engine was turned off. Investigators later determined that within the first 15 minutes, the interior temperature had exceeded 120 degrees, creating life-threatening conditions for a child trapped inside. As the ceremony continued, the temperature inside the vehicle climbed to lethal levels. At some point during that period, Jasper lost consciousness as his body was overwhelmed by the extreme heat. Medical experts later explained that prolonged exposure to extreme heat caused fatal hyperthermia, a condition in which the body can no longer regulate its internal temperature. By the time family members returned to the parking lot, the prolonged heat exposure had already caused irreversible injury. The wedding ceremony concluded after 1 hour and 15 minutes, followed by 20 minutes of photography inside the church. When family members returned to the parking lot, they discovered Jasper unresponsive in the vehicle. Emergency responders were called immediately, but the child showed no signs of life when paramedics arrived. Attempts at rapid cooling and resuscitation were unsuccessful. Jasper was pronounced dead at the scene, with his core body temperature measured at 108 degrees. The medical examiner's investigation determined that death resulted from hyperthermia caused by prolonged exposure to extreme heat in the enclosed vehicle. The parking lot was secured as investigators documented the scene and interviewed family members. Investigators later reconstructed the conditions inside the vehicle, confirming that lethal heat levels were reached within approximately 30 minutes of the engine being turned off. It was October 14, 2015, at a restored farmhouse in rural Michigan. The property had been converted into a wedding venue while maintaining its original 1920s character, complete with hardwood floors, exposed beams, and a large country kitchen that many couples found charming. The farmhouse sat on 40 acres of rolling hills and offered an intimate setting for smaller weddings, typically hosting 50 to 75 guests. Ember Caldwell was 28 years old and worked as a pastry chef at an upscale restaurant in Grand Rapids. She had trained at culinary school and spent 6 years perfecting her skills in professional kitchens, specializing in elaborate wedding cakes and dessert presentations. Ember's expertise and artistic talent had earned her recognition in local food magazines, and she took enormous pride in her ability to create stunning edible masterpieces. When Ember began planning her wedding, she decided to create her own cake rather than hiring another pastry chef. She designed a 4-tier centerpiece featuring hand-piped buttercream, sugar decorations, and multiple flavors, a project that required 2 full days of preparation. Despite the workload, she committed to handling the cake alongside other wedding responsibilities. The farmhouse venue typically prohibited outside use of its kitchen due to insurance concerns and aging equipment. The space relied on a 1950s-era gas range with unreliable pilot lights and an outdated ventilation system limited to a single exhaust fan. Ember requested an exception, citing her professional experience. The owners agreed, provided she attended a safety briefing covering gas shutoff locations, ventilation limits, and emergency procedures. The day before the wedding, Ember began work around 8 a.m. The old range required frequent adjustments, and she repeatedly relit pilot lights throughout the morning. A faint gas odor was noticeable at times, which she attributed to the normal operation of the vintage equipment. By mid-afternoon, Ember had completed the baking and was beginning the complex process of making buttercream and preparing her decorating tools. Around 4 p.m., while creating delicate sugar flowers, the smell of gas had become noticeably stronger throughout the kitchen. Rather than immediately turning off all gas appliances and opening windows to ventilate the space, Ember continued working to maintain her schedule and avoid disrupting the temperature-sensitive buttercream she had just finished making. Ember decided to work quickly to finish her decorations before addressing the gas problem. She continued using the butane torch while gas fumes accumulated in the poorly ventilated kitchen. The combination of leaked gas and an open flame created an extremely dangerous situation that went unrecognized due to her focus on completing the cakework. The ignition occurred at the range when a burner flared unexpectedly as Ember attempted to relight a pilot light. Flames spread quickly across the stovetop and into nearby wooden cabinetry, producing thick smoke that rapidly filled the poorly ventilated kitchen. The flames immediately engulfed the area around the range and began spreading to the wooden cabinets and ceiling. Ember initially attempted to control the fire and secure nearby cake components before evacuating, but the smoke intensified quickly, limiting visibility and making continued movement increasingly difficult. The kitchen's single exit became blocked by flames within seconds, trapping her in the rapidly filling space. The farmhouse's balloon frame wooden construction allowed smoke and heat to move rapidly through the structure, and the kitchen filled with thick smoke that made breathing increasingly difficult. The historic building was not equipped with a sprinkler or automatic fire suppression system. Ember succumbed to smoke inhalation before she could reach the exit or call for help. The fire continued to spread until wedding guests arriving for the rehearsal dinner noticed smoke pouring from the kitchen windows and called emergency services. Firefighters arrived within 25 minutes but were unable to save Ember. Fire investigators determined that she had died from smoke inhalation caused by a kitchen fire that started when leaked gas was ignited by an open flame. The wedding was canceled and the venue remained closed for 8 months while extensive renovations were completed. The owners installed modern gas lines, improved ventilation systems, and implemented strict policies prohibiting guest access to cooking areas. It was April 22, 2013. In the Hudson Valley, New York, a private countryside estate sat under thin spring clouds, the stone patio still damp from morning dew. By late brunch, the lawn was lined with folding chairs and linen-covered tables. Within minutes, a brief celebration would bring the courtyard to a complete stop. At the center stood the bride, Amelia Reed, 27 years old. She worked as a veterinary assistant at a mixed animal clinic outside Poughkeepsie, splitting her days between restraining anxious dogs and assisting in emergency surgeries on horses. She grew up riding, cleaning stalls before school, saving money for tack instead of vacations. She was steady under pressure, used to blood, used to holding gauze tight against wounds while a veterinarian stitched. Weddings were rare breaks from that world. Champagne service followed a rustic theme, and a groomsman brought a decorative cavalry-style saber to perform sabrage, opening sparkling wine by striking along the bottle's seam so internal pressure releases the cork and collar. Each bottle held roughly 90 pounds per square inch of pressure, meaning weakened glass could fracture instead of separating cleanly. The bottle used had been stored in a warm car earlier that morning before being placed unevenly into ice, creating invisible stress lines. Guests gathered in a semicircle on the stone patio with phones raised, while Amelia stood about 3 feet to the left of the bottle's neck. The groomsman positioned the blade along the seam and drew it back. He had watched online videos but had not practiced beyond one attempt at home. He swung forward in one smooth motion. The blade struck slightly below the lip instead of cleanly at the collar. Instead of a clean separation, the glass failed unevenly. The neck shattered downward. The sound was sharper than a cork pop, closer to a small explosion. Champagne sprayed outward in a white burst mixed with fine shards. The bottle exploded instead of opening cleanly, and a thick shard of glass shot sideways from the shattered neck. The fragment, later measured at about 3 inches long with a sharp, tapered edge, struck Amelia on the left side of her neck just below the jaw. At first, several guests thought champagne had splashed her dress. She blinked and brought her hand to her throat. Within seconds, dark red blood began pulsing through her fingers in steady bursts. The carotid artery carries blood from the heart to the brain under strong pressure, and when it is completely cut, bleeding is fast and forceful. Her expression shifted from confusion to weakness. Her knees buckled less than 10 seconds after the impact, and she collapsed. Guests lowered her onto the stone patio and pressed napkins and table linens against the wound. Blood spread quickly across the surface, running into the shallow lines between the stones. Emergency services were called at 12:47 p.m., according to dispatch records later reviewed by investigators. Her movements slowed as blood loss reduced circulation to her brain, leading to dizziness and rapid loss of consciousness. By the time paramedics arrived about 9 minutes later, she had no detectable pulse. They began chest compressions and continued advanced life support on the patio. Despite sustained efforts, she was pronounced dead at the scene. In the investigation that followed, authorities reviewed guest phone recordings and collected glass fragments from the patio. The county medical examiner explained the findings in simple terms. A sharp glass shard had completely severed the left carotid artery. She lost a fatal volume of blood in under 2 minutes. Unconsciousness likely occurred within about 1 minute as blood flow to the brain collapsed. Outside an operating room with immediate surgical control of the vessel, the injury was not survivable. State police ruled the death accidental. The groomsmen faced a civil lawsuit, but no criminal charges. The estate prohibited sabrage and similar demonstrations. Amelia's parents later established a small veterinary scholarship at the community college she once attended, directing funds toward students training for emergency animal care. It was October 12, 2018. At Takachiho Shrine in Miyazaki Prefecture, steady afternoon wind moved through cedar trees above a narrow gravel path carved along a steep ravine. Guests adjusted sleeves and hair as small stones shifted underfoot near an exposed edge, typical of the shrine's historic, minimally protected grounds. Among them was Aiko Tanabe, 24, the bride. She had recently graduated with a degree in architecture focused on traditional wooden structures and planned to work in heritage preservation, restoring aging temples without altering their original form. Choosing a shrine ceremony had been her idea, drawn to spaces where history and structure remained visible in everyday use. Friends said she often noticed small details others missed, straightening uneven displays, adjusting frames, and quietly pointing out structural flaws during visits to historic sites. She treated balance and structure as habits formed long before her career began. That afternoon, she wore a formal white kimono and a sunoka kushi, a broad, rigid bridal headpiece secured into a styled wig with combs and ties. It did not weigh much, but it extended outward from her shoulders, catching more of the wind moving through the gorge. Weather data later reviewed from the nearby Takachiho station recorded sustained winds around 20 miles per hour, with gusts reaching between 40 and 45 as air funneled through the gorge corridor. Like many traditional shrines, the path followed the natural terrain, with gravel layered over compacted soil along a curve that sloped toward a 65 to 75-foot drop onto rock shelves and shallow water below. There were no tall guardrails, only low wooden posts spaced intermittently. Earlier in the afternoon, a shrine attendant mentioned strong crosswinds along the cliffside stretch and suggested keeping photographs closer to the main courtyard. The photographer preferred the gorge backdrop. By then, repeated foot traffic had loosened the top layer of gravel. Aiko stepped onto the narrow curve with 2 bridesmaids several feet behind her, their sandals crunching lightly against the gravel. Other guests stayed back to leave the photographer a clear line of sight. The wind moved left to right across the path in uneven bursts, lifting her wide sleeves and pressing the fabric briefly against her arms before easing again. Small pebbles shifted and skittered toward the exposed edge with each gust. She paused near the outer side of the curve to steady herself, adjusting her stance by inches. Witnesses later said she glanced down briefly at her footing. As another gust pushed through the trees, the headpiece and sleeves caught the air together. This gust was stronger. It did not lift her, but it twisted her upper body to the right. Her right heel rolled on loose gravel. The sole slid outward across the shifting surface. She raised her arms to counterbalance, but the lateral force continued for another fraction of a second. Several witnesses described hearing a short scraping sound as her sandal lost contact. Her body pivoted toward the drop. Gravel scattered beneath her feet. She tipped sideways and disappeared over the edge in less than a second. Two guests lunged forward but stopped short of the exposed rim. Below, observers saw her strike a rock outcrop approximately 25 to 35 feet down before continuing to tumble. Her head made forceful contact with a jagged stone near the base of the ravine. She came to rest against uneven rock near shallow water. Shrine personnel and bystanders moved along a maintenance access route toward the gorge floor. Rope support was required to reach her safely. When responders reached her position, she showed no pulse and no spontaneous respirations. The autopsy documented multiple skull fractures and a high cervical spine dislocation, a break at the upper neck where it connects to the skull. Severe lung contusions and internal bleeding were also present, consistent with high-impact blunt force trauma. The medical examiner concluded that the head and upper cervical injuries would have caused immediate loss of consciousness and were rapidly fatal. Toxicology results were negative. The death was ruled accidental. In the months that followed, shrine officials installed low-profile safety barriers along the exposed curve. The additions preserved the traditional appearance while creating a clearer boundary along the ravine's edge. The previous story showed how a single step can shift everything. It was July 7th, 2016. When the evening air along Gulf Shores, Alabama carried the humid warmth of summer across the white sand beaches. The temperature had reached 91 degrees during the day and remained at 82 degrees as sunset approached over the Gulf of Mexico. A gentle offshore breeze moved at 8 miles per hour, carrying the scent of salt water and the distant sound of waves breaking against the shore. The sky was clear with excellent visibility extending miles over the water. The beachfront wedding ceremony had concluded on a private stretch of sand bordered by sea oats and dune grass. 80 guests gathered on the beach as the sun painted the horizon in shades of orange and pink. Tiki torches provided flickering light along the ceremony area, while string lights connected wooden posts driven into the sand. The reception was planned to continue with a private fireworks display. Caleb Rice, 28, knelt in the sand, adjusting the placement of mortar tubes approximately 50 feet from the guest seating area. The electrical apprentice's confidence with tools and pyrotechnic devices had made him volunteer for the setup when no licensed operator could be secured. His impulsive personality and hands-on approach to problem-solving had served him well in construction work, though he lacked formal training in fireworks safety. The groom, his longtime friend who worked in commercial fishing, had purchased the fireworks from a roadside stand without consulting safety regulations. The display included 12 consumer-grade mortar shells ranging from 3 to 4 inches in diameter, designed to launch 200 to 400 feet into the air. No professional pyrotechnician had been hired due to budget constraints. The mortar tubes had been placed directly into the loose sand without proper stabilization or angled positioning. Standard safety protocols required concrete bases and precise angles to ensure vertical launches, but these materials were not available. The tubes were positioned in a rough line parallel to the water's edge. A chest-mounted action camera recorded Caleb's movements as he prepared the ignition sequence. The footage showed him connecting fuses between the mortar tubes to create a timed display. Guests remained seated in folding chairs positioned approximately 40 feet from the launch area, well inside the danger zone and far short of the recommended safety distance of at least 150 feet. As darkness settled over the beach, Caleb lit the master fuse and stepped back several feet to observe the display. The first mortar fired successfully, sending a burst of red and gold sparks 300 feet above the water. The second tube, inadequately secured in the shifting sand, tilted approximately 15 degrees from vertical as the shell ignited. The 4-inch mortar shell fired horizontally instead of skyward, traveling at high speed toward the guest area. The projectile struck Caleb in the center of his chest before he could react to the misfire. The shell's internal brake charge ignited at low altitude due to improper launch orientation, causing a premature aerial burst directly in front of him, releasing superheated gases and debris. The explosion caused catastrophic chest injuries and massive internal trauma. The force of the blast disrupted vital functions and threw him backward onto the sand, where he lay motionless as smoke and debris settled. The chest-mounted camera recorded Caleb's collapse and the immediate aftermath as wedding guests screamed and rushed toward the launch area. The remaining fireworks were quickly extinguished by guests using sand and water from nearby coolers. Several attendees sustained minor burns and cuts from debris. Emergency responders arrived within 8 minutes of the initial 911 call. Paramedics found Caleb unresponsive with massive chest trauma and no detectable vital signs. Despite immediate resuscitation attempts, he was pronounced dead at the scene from severe chest injuries caused by blast trauma. The beach was immediately cleared of all guests and secured by authorities. The remaining fireworks were handled by explosive disposal technicians, and the action camera footage was secured as evidence. The wedding reception was canceled permanently. The investigation revealed that the mortar tubes lacked proper stabilization and had been positioned too close to spectators. No licensed pyrotechnician had overseen the display. The investigation concluded that improper setup and the absence of professional oversight led to the fatal fireworks incident. It was September 19, 2015, when a backyard wedding celebration in Lubbock, Texas, became the scene of a devastating fireworks accident. The rural property stretched across 5 acres of flat farmland, with the reception area set up near a large oak tree approximately 50 yards from the main house. The evening air was still and dry, typical for late September in West Texas, with temperatures cooling to a comfortable 78 degrees as the sun set over the horizon. Quentin Nash, 36, had volunteered to handle the fireworks display that would cap off his best friend's wedding celebration. Working as a field technician for a telecommunications company, Quentin was accustomed to working with his hands and took pride in his practical problem-solving abilities. His friends often turned to him for help with projects requiring technical skills, and he rarely declined an opportunity to contribute to special occasions. Standing 6 feet 2 inches tall with a sturdy build, Quentin possessed the confidence that came from years of hands-on work experience. The wedding reception had been planned as a casual outdoor affair, with approximately 60 guests gathered around picnic tables and a makeshift dance floor. As the evening progressed, Quentin began setting up the fireworks display he had purchased from a roadside stand earlier that week. The assortment included several mortar-style fireworks designed to launch aerial shells high into the air before exploding in colorful patterns. Quentin positioned the mortar tubes in soft dirt near the edge of the property, approximately 15 feet from where guests had gathered to watch the show. The tubes were simply pushed into the loose soil without any additional stabilization or anchoring system. No safety perimeter had been established, and guests stood within 20 feet of the launch area, eager to get the best view of the display. The celebration had included several hours of drinking, and Quentin had consumed multiple beers throughout the evening. Despite his impaired judgment, he proceeded with the fireworks setup without consulting safety guidelines or asking others to move to a safer distance. No protective equipment was available, and the rural location meant emergency services were at least 20 minutes away. As Quentin began the display, the first few fireworks launched successfully, drawing cheers from the wedding guests. However, one of the mortar tubes had not been properly secured in the soft ground. The recoil from the previous launches had gradually loosened its position, causing it to tilt at a dangerous angle. When Quentin lit the fuse on the next mortar, the unstable tube tipped over completely as the shell ignited. Instead of launching vertically, the unstable mortar tipped sideways as the shell ignited, causing it to detonate at or just above the mouth of the tube. The shell detonated at the mouth of the tipped mortar, releasing its explosive force directly in front of Quentin's head and upper torso at extremely close range. The close-range blast caused catastrophic head and upper body injuries that proved immediately unsurvivable. Quentin collapsed instantly, his body thrown backward by the force of the explosion. He collapsed immediately and showed no purposeful movement or response. Medical examiners later determined that the injuries were immediately fatal. Wedding guests immediately called for emergency assistance, but the remote rural location meant a significant delay in response time. Several guests with medical training attempted to provide aid, but the extent of Quentin's injuries made any intervention futile. He was pronounced dead at the scene when paramedics finally arrived 23 minutes after the initial call. The accident scene was secured and investigated by local fire officials and the county sheriff's department. The remaining fireworks were confiscated and examined, revealing that several were consumer-grade devices not intended for close proximity use. The mortar tube that had tipped over was found to have been inadequately secured in the soft soil. Investigators determined that the accident resulted from improper fireworks setup combined with failure to maintain adequate safety distances. The official cause of death was listed as catastrophic cranial trauma from close-range explosive impact. No charges were filed as the incident was ruled accidental. It was September 17, 2016 in the Colorado Rockies. The mountain resort sat perched at 8,500 feet elevation, surrounded by dramatic cliff faces and sweeping valley views that made it one of the most sought-after wedding destinations in the state. The venue's natural beauty came with inherent dangers, particularly the unstable rock formations that jutted out over steep drops. Garrett Fleming was 34 years old and had built his reputation as a wedding photographer on one simple principle: he would go anywhere and risk anything to capture the perfect shot. His portfolio was filled with breathtaking images of couples posed on cliff edges, mountain peaks, and precarious overlooks that other photographers wouldn't dare attempt. When he arrived at the mountain resort for the wedding weekend, Garrett immediately began scouting locations for dramatic shots. During the Friday evening rehearsal, he identified a rocky outcrop extending roughly 15 feet beyond the main cliff face, overlooking a valley nearly 80 feet below. As he tested angles near the edge, the venue coordinator approached and warned him the outcrop was off-limits due to recent surveys showing erosion and unstable rock. Garrett acknowledged the warning but dismissed it, explaining that he had worked on similar cliff locations many times without incident. When the coordinator reiterated that the restriction applied to all vendors, Garrett pushed back, arguing that the venue was interfering with his ability to deliver what the couple expected. He referenced his contract and threatened to tell the bride and groom the venue was limiting their photos. During cocktail hour, as the sun dropped toward golden hour, Garrett enlisted 2 groomsmen to help carry his equipment to the restricted area. Despite posted warnings, he assured them the access was approved and set up his tripod near the edge to frame the couple against the valley below. Garrett positioned his tripod about 8 feet from the edge and began taking test shots to check his composition and lighting. The bride and groom joined them on the outcrop, trusting Garrett's expertise and excited about the dramatic photos he had promised. Garrett directed them to stand near the edge while he moved backward to capture a wider shot that would show more of the valley below. He was looking through his camera viewfinder, focused on framing the perfect image, when he took 3 steps backward onto a section of rock that looked identical to the stable ground around it. The rock beneath his feet was actually a thin shelf that had separated from the main cliff face but remained in place, held only by friction and a few small contact points. When Garrett's full weight, plus the weight of his camera equipment, pressed down on this unstable section, it gave way instantly. The groomsmen and wedding couple watched in horror as the ground simply disappeared beneath the photographer's feet. Garrett fell backward, still holding his camera, as the rock shelf collapsed. He dropped about 6 feet before hitting a small ledge, then bounced and continued falling toward the valley floor. The entire fall took approximately 4 seconds. The groomsmen immediately called for help, while the bride and groom were led away from the edge by other wedding guests who had heard the commotion. Emergency responders arrived within 45 minutes, but the remote location and steep terrain made recovery efforts extremely difficult. Garrett was found at the base of the cliff, having fallen the full 80 feet onto rocky ground. The impact had caused massive trauma that would have been instantly fatal. Garrett's death was ruled accidental, caused by massive trauma from the fall. The wedding reception was immediately canceled as emergency vehicles filled the resort's parking area. The venue installed more visible safety barriers around all cliff areas and implemented a policy requiring all photographers to stay within designated zones, with signed acknowledgments required before any outdoor photography sessions. It was September 9th, 2016. Late afternoon light settled over Highway 1 near Big Sur, California, the Pacific, stretching flat beyond the cliffs. Cars moved carefully through the winding coastal curves. Before sunset, a motorcycle would slide across the pavement and stop beneath a granite guardrail. The groom, Caleb Turner, 31, had built his life around speed. He grew up riding dirt bikes in inland Monterey County and became a regional motocross champion by his mid-20s. He understood balance, throttle control, and how weight shifts changed traction. His cafe racer was customized by hand, stripped down, lighter than stock, chain and rear sprocket fully exposed. He preferred it that way for easier maintenance and less drag. His wife, Naomi Brooks, 29, had spent 7 years teaching elementary art in Salinas. She was careful in daily life, organized and known for planning months. For the wedding, she chose a cathedral-length veil, nearly 12 feet long, attached with a reinforced metal comb and secured with 14 pins woven tightly into her hair. Once set, it would not pull free without force. She had no riding experience beyond short trips around town. They chose the motorcycle to make the exit memorable. Instead of leaving in a car, they rode ahead of the reception convoy on Caleb's championship cafe racer, planning to meet guests at the venue. The route down included tight bends and short straightaways, with wind rising from the ocean along exposed cliffs. That week, general advisories warned of strong coastal crosswinds, though conditions remained within legal riding limits. Neither of them considered how a 12-foot veil might behave near an exposed drivetrain. Caleb maintained a steady pace as they descended. The motorcycle's rear chain and sprocket were fully exposed, as he preferred for maintenance and weight reduction. Naomi's veil streamed behind her, lifting and snapping in the wind. On one curved stretch, a crosswind pushed the silk lower and outward. At highway speed, the rear chain rotated rapidly around the sprocket teeth. The trailing edge of the veil drifted close enough to brush the spinning assembly. In a fraction of a second, the fabric was pulled into the chain. Because the veil was anchored to her hair with a reinforced comb and multiple pins, it did not tear free. The silk wrapped tightly around the sprocket. The tension snapped hard. Riders behind them later told investigators they saw Naomi's head jerk sharply backward. The force drove her neck into extreme hyperextension. Medical reconstruction later confirmed a fracture at the second cervical vertebra, high in the neck. The spinal cord was severed at that level, causing immediate loss of muscle control and breathing. Her body collapsed against Caleb's back and was then dragged toward the rear wheel as the fabric continued winding into the chain. The sudden shift in weight jammed the wheel. The motorcycle fishtailed briefly before dropping onto its side. Metal scraped loudly against asphalt as the bike slid across the lane. Caleb was thrown forward and to the right. His helmet struck a granite guardrail with enough force to crack the outer shell and snap his head backward. He landed several feet from the motorcycle. Drivers behind them stopped and contacted emergency services immediately. Due to the narrow, winding road, rescue crews arrived approximately 14 minutes later. Both riders were unresponsive when first responders reached them. Investigators reviewed helmet camera data to confirm the sequence, but physical evidence, fabric tightly wound around the sprocket, skid marks from a locked rear wheel, and final body positions established the cause. The coroner ruled Naomi's death an instant high cervical spinal cord injury, while Caleb died at the scene from severe brain trauma and internal bleeding after striking the guardrail. No mechanical defect was found beyond the legally optional missing chain guard. Fabric entanglement with the drivetrain was identified as the primary factor. In the months that followed, the footage circulated as a safety warning, and the chapel revised its wedding guidelines to discourage vehicle departure stunts. It was August the 20th, 2014. In Puerto Vallarta, the late afternoon tide edged closer to a small wooden gazebo set about 36 inches above packed sand. Wind pushed in from the southwest, raising steady whitecaps offshore. Guests noticed the water creeping nearer, but the ceremony continued. At the center of the ceremony stood Camila Torres, 27, the bride, beside her fiancé, Jay Paulson, 31. A graduate student in coastal hydrodynamics at a university in Mexico City, she had spent years studying how waves interact with shorelines, often choosing coastal settings for research trips and family gatherings. Together, they chose a seaside ceremony that reflected that part of her life, incorporating the traditional silver lazo ritual, a figure-8 rope placed around the couple, to symbolize unity during their vows. Friends described her as methodical and calm, someone who trusted preparation and structure even in unpredictable environments. The gazebo had been placed near the upper wet sand margin rather than on fully dry beach. Earlier waves had already reached the lowest step, leaving darker patches along the wood. The wedding planner had reviewed the forecast that morning, and while no storm warnings were issued, marine reports noted a building swell consistent with late summer winds. As part of the ceremony, a traditional silver lazo was draped around Camilla and Jay in a figure-8 pattern, resting across their shoulders as they faced the ocean for photographs. Wind gusts reached around 20 miles per hour, and guests later said intermittent spray had touched the lower boards during earlier wave sets. Camilla briefly glanced toward the advancing foam line before refocusing on the vows. Midway through the ceremony, the photographer asked the couple to step slightly closer to the edge for a clearer shot. Witnesses later described the next incoming wave as larger than the previous ones, though not visually alarming from a distance. It rose within the normal rhythm of the tide, then pushed forward with greater reach. The wave rolled past the wet sand boundary and struck the wooden steps and front supports of the gazebo. Water surged across the deck in a single forceful sheet, and the platform shuddered under the sudden impact. Jay, weighing just over 200 pounds, lost traction as the water covered the boards. He stumbled backward and fell off the side of the gazebo. Because the lazo bound them together, he dropped below deck level while still looped to Camilla's shoulders, transferring his full weight into the rope as he fell. The line snapped tight and slid upward toward her neck. Witnesses saw Camilla pulled sharply toward a support post as the lazo tightened under the sudden weight, her hands rising immediately toward her throat. Jay hit the sand below, but the drop had already created maximum tension in the rope, compressing her airway and the major blood vessels in her neck at the same time. Guests rushed forward. Jay attempted to stand and relieve pressure, but the rope remained taut for several critical seconds, while multiple people worked to loosen the lazo manually. By the time it was pulled free, Camilla had collapsed onto the deck. She was carried onto the sand as emergency responders arrived minutes later, but resuscitation efforts at the scene were unsuccessful. The medical examination documented a fractured hyoid bone, bruising of the larynx, and extensive soft tissue swelling that narrowed the airway. Petechial hemorrhages were present in the eyes and facial skin, with no evidence of drowning. The cause of death was determined to be ligature strangulation resulting from sudden mechanical constriction during the fall. Investigators documented rope tension marks on the vertical support and indentation patterns consistent with witness statements. Reconstruction showed Jay's fall created sufficient downward force to turn the ceremonial rope into a tightening ligature within seconds, and the death was ruled accidental. In the months that followed, the gazebo was relocated farther inland, and organizers began placing stricter limits on elevated shoreline ceremonies during changing tide conditions. Water and movement played a role in that moment. It was June 3, 2018, in California's Central Valley, where afternoon temperatures reached 97 degrees under clear skies. Dry winds swept across farmland as a wind advisory warned of gusts up to 25 miles per hour, intensified by thermal updrafts by mid-afternoon. The backyard reception took place on a 2-acre farm property with tables under white canopies. Recently cut grass remained uneven from gopher holes, and a large inflatable bounce house sat near a sloped edge. Felix Wade, 5, ran between guests wearing khaki shorts and a blue polo shirt. The preschooler's boundless energy had kept him moving constantly since the ceremony ended. His curiosity and fearless nature made him gravitate toward the inflatable attractions. Felix's parents worked in agricultural management and had driven 3 hours from Bakersfield for his aunt's wedding. The bride, his 33-year-old aunt who managed a local credit union, had rented the bounce house to entertain the 40 children among her 160 guests. The rental operator had delivered and inflated the structure that morning, but left before the reception began. No staff member remained to monitor the equipment or provide safety instructions. The bounce house had been secured with metal stakes driven approximately 18 inches into the hard-packed earth. However, the stakes were not fully inserted to their recommended depth of 24 inches, and the tension straps remained loose. The rental company's protocol required constant adult supervision, but no guest had been assigned this responsibility. A GoPro camera mounted inside recorded the children's activities from a corner position. The footage showed Felix and 7 other children jumping as the wind intensified. The inflatable structure swayed noticeably as gusts struck its 12-foot-high walls. A sudden wind gust, intensified by thermal updrafts and inadequate anchoring, struck the bounce house from the west. The inadequately anchored structure lifted on one side, causing the children inside to tumble toward the lower end. Felix was positioned near the center when the inflatable became airborne. The bounce house rotated counterclockwise as it lifted approximately 10 to 12 feet above the ground. The GoPro footage captured Felix being thrown against the interior mesh walls as the structure rotated violently during its brief flight. Other children slid toward the openings as the inflatable lost shape. The structure traveled roughly 30 feet before descending. Felix was ejected head-first through the main entrance during the second rotation, falling approximately 12 feet onto the packed dirt surface. The impact caused severe head trauma and a fatal cervical spine injury. The deflating bounce house settled partially on Felix's motionless body. Wedding guests rushed to lift the heavy vinyl material within seconds. Felix showed no signs of consciousness, pulse, or breathing. His neck was positioned at an unnatural angle, and he remained unresponsive. Emergency responders arrived within 11 minutes of the emergency call. Despite immediate resuscitation attempts, Felix was pronounced dead at the scene from traumatic brain injury and cervical spine dislocation. 7 other children sustained minor injuries. The wedding reception ended immediately as guests were evacuated from the property. The bounce house was deflated and removed that evening. The GoPro footage was seized as evidence as part of the investigation. The investigation revealed that anchor stakes had been installed to insufficient depth and tension straps were improperly secured. Wind conditions exceeded the manufacturer's recommended operational limits of 15 miles per hour. The investigation concluded that inadequate anchoring and the absence of active supervision allowed the inflatable to become airborne under hazardous wind conditions. It was November 12, 2016, when a wedding reception at a historic banquet hall in Albany, New York, turned deadly during what should have been a celebratory exit. The venue, a converted 19th century mansion, featured ornate ballrooms with high ceilings and narrow doorways that reflected the architectural constraints of its era. Selah Brooks, 25, had traveled from Boston to serve as a bridesmaid for her college roommate's wedding. Working as a graduate student in social work, Selah possessed a natural inclination to help others, often putting their needs before her own safety. Standing 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighing 110 pounds, she had a petite frame that made her particularly vulnerable in crowded situations. The evening reception had proceeded smoothly, with dinner service completed and dancing in full swing by 10 o'clock. The venue's event coordinator had planned a coordinated group exit for the newlyweds, where all guests would simultaneously move toward the main entrance while the couple made their departure through a shower of rice and confetti. Red velvet rope barriers had been installed along the sides of the exit corridor to direct the flow of guests. Selah had positioned herself near the doorway to assist elderly guests who might need help navigating the crowd. The music system had been turned up to maximum volume to create excitement during the exit, making verbal communication nearly impossible. As the coordinator signaled for the group departure, nearly 200 guests began moving toward the narrow double doorway simultaneously. The initial movement appeared orderly, but the funnel effect created by the rope barriers and narrow doorway quickly caused compression at the exit point. Guests in the rear of the crowd, unable to see the bottleneck ahead, continued pushing forward with increasing pressure. The doors at the exit became difficult to open as pressure from the crowd built against them, slowing movement at the bottleneck. Selah found herself caught in the surge as bodies compressed around her. The crowd's momentum carried her forward against the door frame, where she became pinned between the wooden structure and the mass of people behind her. Her arms were trapped at her sides, preventing her from protecting herself or signaling for help. The compression increased as more guests joined the exodus from the rear of the ballroom. Selah's chest became severely restricted as bodies pressed against her from multiple directions. The pressure prevented her ribcage from expanding normally, making breathing increasingly difficult. Her small stature meant she was positioned lower than most adults around her. As the pressure intensified, Selah was unable to expand her chest enough to breathe. Within moments, she became disoriented and began losing consciousness as the compression continued. Unable to call for help due to the restricted chest movement and loud music, she gradually lost awareness. The compression continued as guests near the front struggled to widen the opening and relieve the pressure. As the pressure finally began to ease, Sella slid downward but remained upright for a moment, held in place by the surrounding crowd. By the time the crowd had thinned enough for others to notice her condition, she was unresponsive and showed no signs of breathing. Emergency responders arrived within 12 minutes of the 911 call. Paramedics found Sella without a detectable pulse and immediately began resuscitation efforts. Despite advanced life support measures, they were unable to restore circulation. She was pronounced dead at the scene after 30 minutes of unsuccessful attempts. The venue was immediately evacuated and secured for investigation. Multiple guests had recorded videos of the exit on their phones, providing investigators with clear documentation of the crowd dynamics. The medical examiner determined that death resulted from compressive asphyxia caused by chest compression during the crowd surge. Fire safety officials cited multiple code violations, including inadequate exit capacity for the venue's occupancy limit and improper door configuration for emergency egress. The rope barriers that were intended to guide guests had instead created a dangerous funnel effect. It was June 3, 2017, in a small town outside Atlanta, Georgia. The historic church had been built in 1892 and featured soaring ceilings, stained glass windows, and wooden pews that could seat 200 guests. The building's old-world charm made it a popular choice for traditional weddings, though its age meant that modern amenities like air conditioning were limited. Paisley Thornton was 26 years old and worked as a marketing assistant for a small advertising firm in downtown Atlanta. She had been the bride's college roommate, and their friendship had continued strong through the 5 years since graduation. Paisley was known among her friends as someone who always tried to help, often to her own detriment. When the bride began planning her wedding menu 6 months before the ceremony, she sent detailed questionnaires to all members of the wedding party asking about dietary restrictions, food allergies, and meal preferences. Paisley received the form and checked the box marked "None" for allergies. She had experienced those mild reactions as a child, but was confident that her adult system could handle shellfish without problems, and she didn't want to create unnecessary complications for her friend's special day. The bride chose a catering company that specialized in Southern cuisine with an upscale twist. The menu included several seafood options, including bacon-wrapped shrimp appetizers that would be passed during the cocktail hour before the ceremony. During the cocktail hour, servers circulated through the crowd of guests with silver trays of appetizers. When a server approached Paisley and offered her the bacon-wrapped shrimp, she took one without hesitation. The taste was familiar, and Paisley felt satisfied that she had made the right choice in not listing shellfish as an allergy on her form. She continued mingling with other wedding guests and didn't give the appetizer another thought as she prepared for the ceremony to begin. Within 10 minutes, Paisley's throat began to feel tight, and her voice became slightly hoarse. She excused herself to the bathroom and checked her reflection in the mirror. Her face was becoming flushed, and her lips were starting to swell. As her breathing became more labored, she remained in the bathroom for several minutes, apparently trying to manage the worsening symptoms on her own. As the wedding party lined up for the processional, Paisley's breathing became increasingly difficult and audible. Her airway was visibly constricting, and she appeared flushed and distressed. The maid of honor noticed that Paisley was breathing heavily and offered to get help, but Paisley waved her off and insisted she would be fine. She had no previous experience with severe allergic reactions and appeared unaware of how rapidly her condition was deteriorating. The processional music began, and the bridesmaids started walking down the aisle in pairs. Paisley was the third bridesmaid in line, walking with one of the groom's cousins. As they reached the halfway point of the aisle, Paisley began stumbling and appeared disoriented. Her legs became unsteady, and she struggled to continue walking as the allergic reaction reached its peak severity. Paisley collapsed in the center aisle during the processional. Her breathing was severely impaired, and she showed visible signs of oxygen deprivation as nearby guests realized a medical emergency was unfolding. Emergency services were contacted as the bride rushed forward, and guests searched Paisley's belongings for medical information, finding none. Responders arrived 18 minutes later, delayed by heavy weekend traffic around the church. But the anaphylactic reaction had progressed to complete airway closure and cardiovascular collapse, and she could not be revived. Paisley died from anaphylactic shock caused by shellfish exposure. The ceremony was immediately stopped, and guests were asked to leave the church while the situation was handled. The bride was devastated to learn that her best friend had experienced a severe allergic reaction that neither of them had anticipated. The catering company began including more detailed allergen warnings on their menu cards and requiring signed allergy disclosure forms from all members of wedding parties. A hidden medical condition had turned a joyful processional into a scene of horror inside that historic church. It was March 14, 2018. In Cabo San Lucas, Mexico, the marina was bright and breezy, small waves tapping against docked boats as parasails rose and lowered beyond the breakwater. The wind stayed within operating limits. Before sunset, one routine retrieval would fail overhead, leaving the bride hanging and then dropping in front of waiting guests. The bride, Elena Cruz, 32, had built a career around turning risk into content. She ran a travel blog that focused on bold entrances and curated experiences. Brands paid her to show confidence in unfamiliar places. She was organized and driven, careful with contracts and deadlines, but comfortable placing herself in controlled danger if it produced strong visuals. Parasailing depends on a balance between wind speed, tow line tension, and winch control. A harness wraps around the thighs and waist, clipped to a spreader bar that connects to the canopy lines. Riders are usually dressed in light clothing, so straps sit flat against the body. Excess fabric can bunch and shift under load, changing how weight is distributed during takeoff and retrieval. The plan that afternoon was a staged entrance. Elena and her husband would launch from a boat offshore and be reeled toward the beach where guests waited. Her gown had several silk layers and a tight corset bodice. Crew members fitted the parasail harness over the dress without removing the skirt ball. Wind reports showed steady gusts near the upper safe limit, but the operator deemed conditions workable. As they lifted, the canopy filled evenly. Video later reviewed by investigators showed Elena seated properly in the harness, legs forward, skirt fluttering beneath her. The boat maintained speed. After several minutes aloft, the captain began retrieval using the hydraulic winch at the stern. The line tightened, and they started moving slowly toward the platform. Footage from a guest's phone captured a brief hesitation in the winch. The line slackened for less than a second, then snapped taut again. At that moment, a sharp gust pushed the canopy upward. The shift increased tension on a section of tow line where the outer braid had visible wear near a splice. The line failed with a loud crack. The canopy surged sideways. Without a forward pull from the boat, Elena and her husband swung under the chute. The sudden release of tension flipped her inverted. The skirt of her gown lifted over her torso. Silk layers wrapped around the harness straps at her waist and climbed toward her neck as gravity pulled her downward. Witnesses on the boat described her arms moving briefly, then slowing. The video shows her body hanging upside down, the corset compressing her chest. The harness straps, now twisted with fabric, pressed across the front and sides of her neck. Investigators later noted that tight pressure from twisted straps and fabric likely restricted blood flow and breathing as she remained inverted under the canopy. Her husband detached and dropped into the water when the canopy collapsed partially. Elena descended erratically, still inverted. She struck the water hard on her shoulder and side. The boat operator radioed for emergency services immediately. Guests on shore called emergency services. Local rescue arrived in approximately 12 minutes. She was pulled from the water unresponsive. CPR was started on deck. There was no effective pulse. Paramedics continued resuscitation during transport, but pronounced her dead at the marina. The post-mortem examination found deep bruising along the sides of her neck, where straps and twisted fabric had compressed soft tissue. There were fractures of the upper cervical spine and significant swelling around the airway. The medical examiner concluded she died from asphyxia due to neck compression, compounded by blunt force injuries from the fall. The parasail company's equipment was inspected. Investigators documented wear at the failed splice and noted the harness had been fitted over bulky clothing. The resort ended parasail wedding entrances after the incident. Elena's blog followers later shared the footage as a warning about combining formal attire with high-tension water sports. It was June 14th, 2015. At a private skydiving drop zone near Lodi, California, a wedding party gathered beside a dusty runway for vows and freefall. Surface winds were light, with a steady upper-level drift noted during the morning load brief as jumpers prepared their equipment. Among the group was Daniel Ruiz, 56. After 3 decades teaching civics at a local high school, retirement led him toward officiating unconventional weddings, ceremonies built around controlled risk. He had logged 287 solo jumps over the years, experienced for a recreational skydiver but not rated as an instructor. Most of his experience came from standard formation jumps and solo descents in clear conditions. That day, he agreed to lead vows in freefall, framing the event as symbolic but controlled. The couple was newly licensed skydivers cleared for independent jumps. Their plan was simple: exit together, hold a brief formation, then separate and deploy at 5,000 feet in line with drop zone policy. Staff approved it with firm limits: no low pulls, no canopy proximity after opening, and nothing that could interfere with emergency handles. Daniel wore a standard sport rig and secured a laminated vow card flat against his chest strap. The gear check showed no loose or misrouted equipment. At 14,000 feet, the door opened over dry farmland with winds still within operating limits. The group exited in sequence, stabilized quickly, linked hands for several seconds, then separated cleanly at the planned altitude. At deployment height, the couple waved off and pulled, their rectangular canopies inflating symmetrically before settling into steady forward flight. Observers below saw 2 predictable descent patterns drifting toward the landing area as Daniel deployed seconds later. His pilot chute launched cleanly, extracting the main canopy from the container. The fabric began to spread, but then snapped sharply to one side when part of the canopy folded over a suspension line. The parachute entered a tightening rotation, forming a visible corkscrew pattern that accelerated with each revolution. Witnesses reported the descent rate increasing as the spin failed to correct itself. From the ground, the malfunction intensified the spin, increasing both rotation and descent speed. Daniel appeared to reach upward toward the risers, attempting to counter the movement as the canopy continued tightening into a corkscrew pattern. Altitude dropped rapidly through 3,000 feet. The rotation showed no signs of slowing as he descended past 2,000. At approximately 1,300 feet, he initiated emergency procedures. The main canopy released as he pulled the cutaway handle. The reserve deployed immediately and inflated, but the remaining altitude was minimal. The spin stopped, yet there was not enough vertical distance to slow to a survivable landing speed. Witnesses saw the reserve overhead for only seconds before impact. He struck the dirt landing area at high vertical speed and did not move. Staff reached him within moments and began emergency procedures. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner documented multiple skull fractures, a high cervical spine injury, rib fractures, and severe internal trauma consistent with a high-speed vertical impact. Equipment inspection confirmed a line-over malfunction in the main canopy, while the reserve deployed correctly but too low to achieve full deceleration. Toxicology results were negative, and the death was ruled accidental, with delayed emergency action identified as the primary contributing factor. In the months that followed, the drop zone banned handheld props during staged ceremony jumps and introduced stricter deployment altitude minimums with closer instructor oversight. Investigators concluded that the malfunction itself was survivable, but the reduced altitude left no margin for recovery, and the case was formally closed as an accidental death during a staged wedding skydive. The first story unfolded in open sky, where altitude left little room for hesitation. It was August 12, 2017, in Provo, Utah, as late summer heat lingered over the foothills of the Wasatch Mountains. Daytime temperatures had reached 89 degrees, cooling to 76 by 8:30 p.m., while intermittent canyon winds gusted through the outdoor venue. The ceremony had just ended on a grassy slope overlooking Utah Valley. String lights hung above rows of white folding chairs as the sun dipped behind the mountains and the first stars appeared. A light breeze moved through the reception area, where guests prepared for the evening send-off. Holly Vance, 27, stood near the venue's stone archway, adjusting her full-length wedding gown. The elementary school teacher's attention to detail showed in every aspect of the ceremony planning. Her methodical nature had guided months of preparation, though her non-confrontational personality had led her to accept suggestions she privately questioned. The synthetic lace dress, featured intricate beadwork and a flowing train that extended 4 feet behind her. Her new husband, a 31-year-old logistics coordinator, had organized the sparkler send-off as the evening's finale. 12 wedding attendants and 90 guests, including several young children, had gathered to form a tunnel leading from the ceremony site to the reception area. The groom's practical background in coordinating shipments had not extended to event safety protocols. Long metal sparklers, each measuring 20 inches in length, were distributed to every guest without accompanying safety instructions. No fire extinguishers were positioned nearby, and venue staff had not been briefed on emergency procedures. Children as young as 6 were positioned at the front of the tunnel, closest to where the couple would pass. 2 smartphones captured the scene from different angles. One guest recorded from the reception area, facing the approaching couple, while another filmed from behind to document their exit through the sparkling archway. The wind continued to gust intermittently, causing the sparklers to flicker and bend toward the center of the tunnel. As Holly and her husband began their walk through the tunnel, the sparklers created a canopy of white-hot sparks approximately 6 feet above the ground. The metal rods burned at temperatures capable of exceeding 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit at the tip, sending cascades of molten particles into the evening air. Holly's train dragged along the grass behind her. A sparkler held by a child in the front row tilted downward as the wind gusted, bringing the burning tip into contact with the lower hem of Holly's dress. The synthetic lace fabric ignited instantly upon contact with the superheated metal. Flames spread upward along the dress with remarkable speed, following the synthetic fibers and beadwork. Within seconds, flames driven by wind and rising heat traveled from the hem to Holly's waist. She stumbled forward as the flames reached her torso, the synthetic material melting and adhering to her skin. The rapid combustion created superheated gases that she inhaled, causing immediate swelling in her airway passages. Her breathing became labored as oxygen flow was restricted. Guests attempted to extinguish the flames using their bare hands and clothing, but the synthetic material continued burning. Several attendants suffered second-degree burns. Holly collapsed onto the grass as fire enveloped her lower body, with the front-facing smartphone capturing the collapse as her movements slowed and stopped. Emergency responders arrived within 6 minutes of the initial emergency call. Paramedics found Holly unconscious with severe thermal injuries covering 40% of her body. Despite immediate medical intervention, she suffered cardiac arrest due to severe inhalation injury and extensive thermal burns and was pronounced dead after resuscitation efforts failed. 7 guests required treatment for burns sustained while attempting the rescue. The reception was immediately canceled, and the venue was cleared by emergency personnel. Both smartphone recordings were secured by investigators as part of the official inquiry. The investigation determined that the synthetic fabric had ignited at a temperature consistent with sparkler contact. Wind conditions had contributed to the sparkler's displacement, while the absence of safety equipment prevented effective fire suppression. It was February 14, 2017, when a Valentine's Day wedding celebration in Kansas City, Missouri, turned into an unthinkable tragedy. Outside, winter clung to the streets in brittle silence, but inside the hotel's grand ballroom, warmth and laughter filled the air. Gold uplighting reflected off polished hardwood floors as guests packed the room, eager to witness a night meant to be unforgettable. Tobias Clay, 31, had always been known as the man who never said no. Friends described him as the glue of every gathering, the one who showed up early, stayed late, and made sure everyone was having a good time. As a logistics coordinator for a shipping company, Tobias handled planning and precision during the work week, but in social settings, he trusted momentum over caution. He believed moments mattered more than hesitation, and nothing bothered him more than disappointing the people around him. That instinct followed him into his wedding night. Tobias stood tall at 6 feet, his athletic frame shaped by weekend basketball games and years of saying yes to whatever the group wanted to do. His groomsmen joked that he could turn any room into a party, and Tobias wore that reputation proudly. Tonight wasn't about second-guessing or slowing things down. It was about celebration, about giving everyone the moment they expected. The evening unfolded flawlessly. Dinner passed without incident. Heartfelt toasts drew laughter and tears, and Tobias and his bride, Tara, shared their first dance as husband and wife to a slow jazz melody. As the song faded, applause rippled through the room. Then came the shout Tobias recognized instantly, the call for the chairlift ceremony. Phones rose into the air. Guests cheered. Friends turned toward him, grinning, already moving a chair into position. Tobias felt the familiar pull of expectation. He could have waved it off. He could have suggested something else. But refusing would have broken the rhythm of the room, and Tobias had never been the man to stop the music. 4 groomsmen stepped forward, energized and laughing, their coordination dulled by multiple rounds of drinks throughout the evening. Earlier, hotel staff had removed the anti-slip mats to clear space for dancing, leaving the hardwood floor glossy and slick beneath polished dress shoes. A standard banquet chair, designed for seating, not lifting, was positioned behind Tobias, its worn joints unnoticed in the excitement. As upbeat music filled the ballroom, Tobias sat down without hesitation. He gripped the sides of the chair, trusting his friends the way he always had. The groomsmen lifted him several feet into the air, faces flushed with effort and alcohol. At 215 pounds, Tobias's weight shifted unevenly as they began bouncing him to the beat. The chair flexed under the strain. One groomsman, standing at the front left, struggled to maintain his grip as his leather-soled shoes slid against the slick floor. As the group bounced again, his footing gave way. His hands slipped free as he stumbled backward. The sudden loss of support caused the chair to pitch forward violently. Tobias had no time to react. Still gripping the seat, he was thrown headfirst toward the hardwood floor below. His head and neck struck with devastating force, producing a dull, unnatural sound that cut through the music. The chair collapsed beside him, its joints giving way as guests screamed and rushed forward. The DJ stopped the music, seconds too late. Tara dropped to her knees beside her husband, her wedding dress spreading across the floor as she called his name. Tobias did not move. Emergency responders arrived within 8 to 10 minutes of the 911 call. Tobias was unresponsive, with no detectable pulse or breathing. Despite immediate resuscitation efforts, he was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner later determined that the fall caused catastrophic fractures to the upper cervical vertebrae, resulting in rapid respiratory failure and irreversible neurological injury. The ballroom was cleared and secured. Multiple guests had captured the moment on video, documenting how celebration turned to silence in seconds. Investigators confirmed the chair was a standard banquet model never intended for overhead lifting or dynamic movement. Tobias Clay didn't die taking a reckless risk alone. He died trusting the moment, trusting the people around him, and believing that saying yes just one more time was the right thing to do. It was May 21st, 2016, at a desert resort outside Scottsdale, Arizona. The venue specialized in outdoor ceremonies that took advantage of the dramatic Sonoran desert landscape, with towering saguaro cacti and red rock formations providing a stunning natural backdrop. The resort was popular with couples seeking a unique southwestern wedding experience, though the desert environment presented challenges including extreme heat, limited shade, and the need for careful planning around weather conditions. Roderick Vale was 42 years old and had been performing wedding ceremonies for over 15 years. He was an ordained minister who had left traditional church ministry to focus exclusively on weddings, finding deep satisfaction in helping couples begin their married lives. Roderick had officiated more than 200 weddings throughout Arizona and was known for his warm, personalized approach and his ability to create meaningful ceremonies that reflected each couple's unique relationship. The wedding was scheduled for 4 p.m. on a Saturday afternoon, with the ceremony taking place on an outdoor terrace overlooking the desert valley. The temperature that day reached 105 degrees Fahrenheit, which was unusually hot even for late May in Arizona. The resort had set up a tent to provide some shade for the wedding party, but the ceremony location itself was in direct sunlight to take advantage of the dramatic lighting and desert views. Roderick lived in Phoenix, about 3 hours away from the resort, and he had driven to the venue that morning to allow time for final preparations and a brief rehearsal with the couple. The long drive in his car, which had air conditioning problems, left him somewhat dehydrated by the time he arrived. As Roderick prepared for the ceremony, he began to feel emotionally affected by the couple's story in an unexpected way. The bride had lost her father to cancer 2 years earlier, and she had specifically chosen this date for her wedding because it was her father's birthday. As the ceremony began, Roderick was completely focused on creating a beautiful experience for the couple. He delivered the opening remarks flawlessly, his voice carrying clearly across the desert landscape to the 75 guests who had gathered to witness the wedding. The bride and groom were moved by his words, and several guests commented that they had never heard such a heartfelt and personal ceremony. During the exchange of rings, Roderick began to appear slightly unsteady and showed signs of disorientation. Despite these visible symptoms, he continued with the ceremony without pausing. The combination of dehydration, extreme heat, emotional stress, and his unknown genetic condition was creating the perfect storm for a catastrophic medical event. As the bride began reciting her personal vows, which included several references to her deceased father and her gratitude for finding love after loss, Roderick suddenly grabbed his head and appeared to be in severe distress. The aneurysm in his brain, weakened by years of undetected deterioration and triggered by the combination of physical and emotional stress, suddenly ruptured. The rupture caused a sudden subarachnoid hemorrhage, leading to immediate loss of consciousness. Roderick collapsed without warning, falling backward onto the desert stone terrace in full view of the wedding party and all the guests. The bride stopped speaking mid-sentence, and the groom immediately knelt down to try to help. Several guests who had medical training rushed forward, but Roderick was already unconscious and showing signs of severe neurological damage. Emergency services were called immediately, but the remote desert location meant that it took nearly 35 minutes for paramedics to arrive. The resort staff did everything they could to provide assistance, including bringing ice to try to cool Roderick's body temperature and providing shade while they waited for professional help. Despite aggressive treatment by emergency responders, Roderick never regained consciousness. Roderick suffered a fatal subarachnoid hemorrhage caused by a ruptured cerebral aneurysm. Dehydration, extreme heat, and emotional stress were identified as contributing factors to the rupture of a blood vessel weakened by an undiagnosed genetic condition. The ceremony was immediately stopped, and guests were asked to move indoors while emergency responders worked. The resort implemented new safety protocols for outdoor ceremonies, including mandatory water stations for all wedding party members and requirements for shade coverage during ceremonies lasting longer than 30 minutes. It was May 17, 2014, inside a converted warehouse loft in Chicago, Illinois, where a wedding reception unfolded beneath exposed beams and string lights. The industrial space looked solid at first glance, but parts of the overhead structure were only decorative, a hidden weakness waiting to fail. Evan Morales, 28 years old, sold construction materials to contractors and architects and had known the groom since their early warehouse jobs years earlier. He was careful with numbers, steady with people, and proud of being useful without being loud. As one of the groom's longtime friends, he helped with small logistics during planning, but stepped back from venue decisions, trusting the hired vendors to handle the details above him. In contrast, Lila Hart, 26, was a close friend of the bride from a shared fitness studio. She made her living through movement, coaching flexibility, and core strength while performing short pole routines at local showcases. She understood that fast spins increase force as the body swings outward. What she did not know was how the ceiling above the dance floor had been finished. Steel beams were wrapped in hollow faux wood shells to hide wiring. 3 days before the wedding, a portable pole was installed as part of a surprise reception segment arranged by friends of the couple, and its ceiling plate was screwed into that shell with 4 lag bolts that penetrated only about 1.5 inches. That night, Lila planned a brief routine as a private gift for the newlyweds, filmed on phones and caught by a security camera over the bar. The routine was more aggressive than her usual class demos, and Evan's chair, placed near the dance floor among the groom's close friends, sat in the swing path. A staff notice about not attaching gear to decorative ceiling features was taped near a service door, but it was missed. A friend asked if it was solid. The installer nodded and kept working to stay on schedule. The music started, and Lila opened with slow turns and a controlled climb. The force on the pole stayed mostly vertical, and the ceiling plate appeared steady. For nearly 2 minutes, nothing shifted. Then she moved into an inverted spin, lifting her hips, extending her legs, and swinging her body outward. The direction of force changed sharply from downward to sideways. Several guests later described hearing a dry crack like wood splitting. The ceiling plate jerked once and then tore free. 2 bolts sheared immediately, and the other 2 ripped through the hollow shell, leaving a jagged opening in the faux beam. The pole dropped with her weight still attached and pivoted as it fell, turning into a heavy lever. The base plate swung downward in a clean arc and struck Evan on the right temple. The impact made a sharp metal-on-bone sound that cut through the music. He collapsed instantly, his body going limp before he reached the floor. Lila released her grip too late and fell about 7 feet. She landed hard on her left side as the pole crashed across her pelvis and pinned her legs beneath it. Her lower body twisted at an unnatural angle. She tried to move but could not shift her hips. Her skin drained of color as blood pooled beneath her from internal injuries that were not immediately visible. Guests stepped back while staff rushed in to clear the area. Emergency services were called immediately as staff opened the freight entrance for paramedics. Evan's pulse faded during transport, and he was pronounced dead shortly after arrival from catastrophic head trauma. Lila was rushed into surgery but died from massive internal bleeding caused by an unstable pelvic fracture. The reception ended early as guests were escorted out and the venue secured for investigation. Police collected the fallen pole, bolts, and video footage, later confirming the mounting failure. Civil claims followed, and the venue was required to document true structural anchor points for future events, turning the celebration into a case study in overlooked safety warnings. It was February 3, 2017. Inside a marble corridor at a heritage wedding venue in Udaipur, Rajasthan, guests press shoulder to shoulder for a ritual that usually ends in laughter. The centuries-old palace passages were built for small processions, not modern guest lists. The polished marble floor reflected the afternoon light, already crowded to near capacity. Near the altar stood Riya Malhotra, 15, a younger cousin on the bride's side. A 10th grade student who excelled in debate, she was calm in front of crowds and used to the noise and energy of large family gatherings. Smaller than many of the adults around her, she moved easily through busy celebrations where weddings felt familiar, predictable, and loud. The corridor measured roughly 8 feet wide, bordered on one side by carved stone railings overlooking a lower courtyard. On the other side stood thick sandstone walls. The marble floor had been polished repeatedly over the years, and under leather sandals and formal shoes, it offered limited traction. There were no temporary barriers, ushers, or designated crowd controls in place. The space relied entirely on guests moderating themselves. When the Juda Chupai ritual began, the groom removed his shoes at the entrance as custom required. Male cousins quickly surrounded them in mock defense as the bride's relatives surged forward to steal them, laughing and shouting negotiated demands. Witnesses later estimated that around 40 people entered the corridor within seconds. Some had been standing outside and rushed in once they heard cheering. Movement tightened almost immediately. Those near the center had little visibility of the floor and could not see if someone ahead had stumbled. The noise level increased, echoing off stone walls and amplifying confusion. Riya stood near the stone railing just behind the bride, close enough to watch, but not actively participating. She turned slightly to make space as more relatives pressed inward. A sudden push from behind forced her forward. Her shoes slipped against the polished marble and she lost her balance, falling backward into the carved balustrade. The stone edge struck across her lower back. Before she could steady herself, 2 people stumbled into her legs. She tried to rise, but the pressure from behind intensified. The surge was not a running stampede. It was a dense, slow compression. Guests were pressed chest to back with almost no ability to step sideways or retreat. Those farther back continued pushing, unaware that the front rows had stopped moving. Riya became pinned upright against the railing. Her back was braced against stone. Her torso was trapped by the combined weight of bodies in front of her. Her arms were restricted at her sides, unable to lift high enough to signal distress. Witnesses later said that from a distance, she appeared crouched or bent as part of the game. The ritual's shouting masked any call for help. Visibility was limited to the backs of other guests' heads and shoulders. As compression continued, her chest movement became visibly restricted. Witnesses nearby later said she appeared unable to take full breaths while the crowd pressed forward, unaware that those at the front could no longer move. Those immediately around her did not realize she was already in distress. It took several seconds after the forward momentum eased for anyone to notice she was unresponsive. When the crowd finally shifted and bodies redistributed, her weight was no longer supported. She slid down along the railing to the floor. Laughter stopped abruptly. Emergency personnel arrived within standard urban response time. She had no pulse and was not breathing. Resuscitation efforts were attempted at the scene but were unsuccessful. The post-mortem examination documented bruising across her chest and shoulders and non-displaced rib fractures consistent with sustained external compression. There was no major internal bleeding. Petechial hemorrhages, small red spots in the eyes and facial skin, indicated oxygen deprivation. The official cause of death was compressive asphyxia due to crowd collapse. Investigators concluded that overcrowding inside the confined marble corridor created fatal compressive forces, with no evidence of intentional harm or structural failure. The death was officially ruled accidental. In the months that followed, the venue introduced guest flow limits and assigned attendants to monitor crowd density during high-energy rituals. It was October 14, 2015, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, as evening temperatures dropped to 42 degrees. Inside a historic ballroom, warm chandelier light reflected off polished hardwood floors while Lake Michigan lay dark beyond the windows. The indoor wedding reception was in full swing by 9 p.m., with 120 guests celebrating beneath exposed brick walls and vintage industrial fixtures. The open bar had been serving continuously since cocktail hour began at 6 p.m., with no scheduled breaks or water service stations positioned near the head table. Multiple toasts had been planned consecutively as part of the evening's entertainment program. Lana Brooks, 34, sat at the head table wearing a burgundy bridesmaid dress and holding her fourth glass of champagne. The real estate assistant's competitive personality had driven her to participate enthusiastically in every drinking game organized by the wedding party. Her habitual weekend binge drinking had built a tolerance that masked the severity of her intoxication from concerned friends. The maid of honor, a 36-year-old marketing professional, had already delivered her prepared speech when Lana decided to offer an impromptu toast. The bartender, a temporary hire without certification in responsible alcohol service, had continued serving drinks without monitoring consumption levels. No venue staff had been trained to recognize signs of dangerous intoxication. A smartphone positioned on the gift table recorded the speeches from approximately 15 feet away, capturing audio and video of the head table area. The footage showed Lana consuming multiple shots of vodka during a bridesmaid drinking game before standing unsteadily to address the crowd. As Lana rose from her chair to deliver her unscheduled toast, her coordination was severely impaired by visible intoxication with pronounced imbalance and slurred speech. She swayed noticeably while attempting to speak, her words slurred and barely audible over the background music and conversation. Within seconds of standing, Lana lost her balance and fell backward. Her head struck the hardwood dance floor with significant force, the impact occurring at the base of her skull where it met her neck. The fall caused immediate loss of consciousness and a severe head injury. The head trauma triggered vomiting while Lana remained unconscious and lying on her back. Her severely impaired gag reflex, compromised by alcohol poisoning, failed to clear the vomit from her airway. The aspirated material blocked oxygen flow to her lungs as she lay motionless on the dance floor. Wedding guests initially assumed Lana had simply passed out from excessive drinking, a conclusion that delayed immediate medical intervention. The smartphone continued recording as several attendees approached but hesitated to assist, uncertain whether her condition required emergency care. After several minutes, guests realized her breathing was irregular and ineffective and attempted CPR despite airway obstruction. However, the aspirated vomit had already caused severe oxygen deprivation to her brain and vital organs. Her breathing was irregular and ineffective as her condition visibly deteriorated. Emergency responders arrived 11 minutes after the initial 911 call. They found Lana unresponsive, with no detectable pulse or spontaneous breathing. Despite aggressive resuscitation efforts, including intubation and cardiac medications, she was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner determined that Lana died from aspiration of gastric contents compounded by blunt force head trauma. Post-mortem toxicology later measured her blood alcohol concentration at 0.24%. The combination of alcohol poisoning and head injury had created a fatal scenario. The wedding reception ended immediately as guests were asked to leave the venue. The smartphone recording was turned over to investigators as part of the investigation. The venue was closed for professional cleaning and remained shuttered for 3 days. The subsequent investigation found no criminal negligence, though it highlighted the dangers of excessive alcohol service without proper monitoring. The venue implemented new policies requiring certified bartenders and mandatory water stations at all future events. Lana Brooks died on the dance floor after collapsing during an unscheduled toast. The medical examiner attributed her death to aspiration following acute alcohol intoxication and head trauma. It was June 18, 2015, when a lakeside wedding in Branson, Missouri turned fatal beneath a picture-perfect afternoon sky. Earlier thunderstorms had passed through the region, leaving Table Rock Lake calm and reflective, while the wooden dock remained damp beneath the fading humidity. To arriving guests, the setting looked idyllic, exactly as the bride had intended. Veda Monroe, 28, believed that moments mattered most when they looked effortless. As an administrative assistant for a regional insurance firm, she was accustomed to structure and follow-through, but her wedding had become something more than a checklist. It was a carefully composed image, one she had rehearsed in her mind for months. Any compromise, any visible imperfection felt like failure. From the beginning, Veda insisted on overseeing the lakeside decor herself. She rejected exposed wiring and visible power sources, worried they would ruin the atmosphere. Decorative string lights were routed along the dock railing and concealed beneath outdoor rugs so the sunset glow would appear clean and uninterrupted. When minor concerns were raised about moisture on the dock after the morning storms, Veda dismissed them. The rain had stopped, the lights were beautiful, and the dock looked safe. To her, appearance equaled control. The ceremony was scheduled for late afternoon, with 50 guests seated in white folding chairs arranged along the dock. A standard 120-volt outlet in a nearby utility shed powered the lights, feeding electricity through extension cords hidden beneath the rugs. During installation, one section of cord had suffered a small tear in its protective coating. The damage remained invisible, masked by fabric and decoration, out of sight, and therefore, in Veda's mind, out of danger. As guests settled in, Veda emerged from the lakeside cabin wearing her grandmother's pearl necklace and carrying a bouquet of white lilies. She chose to walk barefoot, believing it completed the natural, intimate look she wanted captured in photographs. The wooden planks felt cool beneath her feet as she stepped onto the dock, focused not on the surface beneath her, but on the image ahead. Near the ceremony platform, Veda reached for the metal handrail lining the dock, steadying herself as she approached her fiancé. Beneath a decorative rug nearby, the frayed extension cord lay in pooled rainwater that had collected since the morning storm. When Veda's bare feet contacted the damp surface, electrical current leaked into the standing water and traveled through her body as she grasped the metal railing. The shock caused immediate involuntary muscle contractions, locking her grip in place. Unable to release the railing, electrical current continued flowing through her body for several critical seconds. Guests initially mistook the moment for a stumble until Veda's body went rigid and her expression changed. A nearby guest disconnected the power moments later, but the damage had already been done. The electrical current had disrupted her heart's rhythm, sending it into ventricular fibrillation. Veda collapsed onto the dock as soon as the power was cut, her breathing shallow and irregular. Emergency services were called immediately, but the lakeside location delayed response times. Guests trained in CPR attempted resuscitation while waiting for paramedics. Despite their efforts, Veda remained unresponsive. Emergency responders arrived 22 minutes after the call and were unable to restore a sustainable cardiac rhythm. She was pronounced dead at the ceremony site. The fire marshal's investigation identified the frayed extension cord as the source of the electrical fault. The outlet powering the lights lacked ground fault circuit interrupter protection, allowing current to leak into standing water. Investigators concluded that electrocution due to faulty wiring was the cause of death. In the hours after the dock was cleared, the string lights remained glowing softly against the water, still beautiful, still intact. The scene looked exactly as Veda had envisioned, except the bride was gone and the perfection no longer mattered. It was August 12, 2018, at a luxury beachfront resort on Florida's Gulf Coast. The property featured pristine white sand beaches, palm trees, and an infinity pool that seemed to blend seamlessly with the ocean horizon. The resort was known for hosting elaborate destination weddings with packages that included ceremony spaces, reception venues, and accommodations for wedding parties and guests. Tanner Blackwood was 31 years old and worked as an investment banker for a major firm in Tampa. His job required him to work 80-hour weeks analyzing market trends and managing client portfolios, leaving little time for physical fitness or recreational activities. Tanner's lifestyle consisted primarily of long days at the office, business dinners, and weekend work sessions that kept him chained to his computer and phone. During the cocktail hour before the reception, Tanner consumed 4 glasses of champagne and 2 whiskey cocktails in the span of 90 minutes. His alcohol tolerance was relatively low due to his demanding work schedule, which left little time for regular drinking, and the tropical heat intensified the effects of the alcohol in his system. By the time dinner was served, Tanner was noticeably intoxicated, speaking loudly and becoming increasingly boastful about his various abilities and accomplishments. As the evening progressed, Tanner and his groomsmen drifted toward the pool beside the reception terrace. The infinity edge distorted depth perception, especially under low lighting and alcohol impairment. Around 9 p.m., Tanner boasted about his supposed diving skills and was encouraged to demonstrate them. He stepped to what appeared to be the deep end, where depth markers and no diving symbols were partially obscured by wedding decor. In reality, the water was only 4 feet deep, a difference he failed to recognize in his intoxicated state. The groomsmen gathered around to watch, with some of them taking out their phones to record what they expected to be an impressive display of athleticism. Other wedding guests on the terrace noticed the commotion around the pool, but assumed it was just a typical reception celebration and didn't pay close attention to what was happening. Tanner raised his arms above his head in a classic diving position and launched himself toward the water. His form was actually quite poor, with his body angled too steeply and his arms positioned incorrectly, but his intoxication prevented him from recognizing these problems. He entered the water head first with significant force, expecting to glide smoothly into deep water. Instead, Tanner's head struck the pool bottom with tremendous impact. The 4-foot depth was insufficient to accommodate his diving trajectory, and his skull hit the concrete bottom at nearly full force. The impact caused immediate unconsciousness and severe head trauma, and Tanner's body went limp in the water. The groomsmen initially thought Tanner was showing off by staying underwater for an extended period, and they laughed and called for him to surface. It took nearly 30 seconds before they realized that something was wrong and that Tanner wasn't moving. By the time they pulled him from the pool, he had been underwater for almost a minute and showed no signs of consciousness or breathing. Resort staff immediately called emergency services and began CPR, but Tanner's head injuries were too severe for resuscitation efforts to be effective. Emergency responders arrived within 8 minutes and continued advanced life support measures, but Tanner was pronounced dead at the scene. Tanner died from catastrophic head and cervical trauma sustained on impact with the pool bottom, with secondary drowning and acute alcohol intoxication contributing to the fatal outcome. Autopsy results later revealed severe alcohol intoxication that contributed to his impaired judgment. The reception ended immediately as emergency vehicles arrived and guests were asked to return to their rooms. The resort later implemented several new safety measures, including depth markers, visible even in low light, and mandatory lifeguard presence during any evening events involving pool access. It was July 2nd, 2015. In Detroit, Michigan, United States, a renovated warehouse glowed under string lights and exposed brick. The concrete floor was clean, the bar ready, and wide doors let in warm summer air. Above the dance floor, exposed metal conduits carried live electricity unnoticed. Under those live lines, the bridesmaid, Rachel Kim, 25, moved easily through the reception crowd. She was a graduate architecture student focused on adaptive reuse of industrial buildings, studying how old factories could become public spaces without hiding their structure. Friends described her as careful, patient, and detail-driven. Original electrical systems remained high along the walls, including 480-volt copper bus bars feeding the lighting and sound equipment. Most sections were shielded, but an improperly covered area near a maintenance column left part of the line accessible, a violation investigators later documented. The clearance met warehouse standards, not event space safety requirements. That night, the couple planned a grand exit through the loading doors. Guests were handed 36-inch sparklers with metal cores and wire handles and formed two lines to create a tunnel of light. Rachel, as maid of honor, wanted a higher angle for a photo of the bride and groom walking through. She pulled a metal folding chair from a nearby table and placed it close to the wall. The chair was made of steel tubing with worn rubber feet. Above that section of wall ran thick electrical bus bars that powered the building's lighting and sound system. They sat just above decorative string lights. A portion of the bus bar near a column had only partial plastic covering. Rachel stepped onto the chair and raised her lit sparkler overhead. Witnesses later said she leaned back slightly to widen her view. As she shifted her arm, the metal tip of the sparkler made contact with the exposed bus bar. The reaction was immediate. A bright, blue-white flash jumped from the contact point, stronger and sharper than the orange sparkler flame. A loud crack echoed across the warehouse, and some of the lights flickered. Guests closest to her saw her body stiffen instantly, arms locked in place. Electric current traveled down the metal shaft into her hand. Because she was standing on a metal chair, her body completed a path through the conductive frame into the building's grounded structure. The current passed across her chest, interfering with the electrical signals that control the heart. She fell backward off the chair and struck the floor. For a moment, several guests thought a firework had malfunctioned. When she did not respond, people rushed forward and moved the sparkler away. Emergency services were called immediately. Fire and medical crews arrived within minutes. Paramedics found Rachel unresponsive with no detectable pulse. They began chest compressions and attached a defibrillator. The first rhythm check showed ventricular fibrillation, a chaotic heart rhythm often triggered by electrical shock. They delivered multiple shocks and continued CPR. Small burn marks were visible on both palms where the current entered her body, with additional burns on her thigh and foot marking where it exited. She was transported to a nearby hospital, but her heart never regained a stable rhythm. She was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. Investigators later reviewed venue surveillance to confirm the sequence of events and documented the exposed bus bar and contact point as evidence. The medical examiner later explains the injuries in simple terms. The electricity passed through her chest and stopped her heart almost immediately. The burns on her hands and leg marked the path the current took. There were no broken bones and no internal bleeding. The fatal injury was electrical disruption of the heart. State safety regulators inspected the warehouse days later, citing improper shielding of high-voltage equipment and inadequate clearance in a public event space. The venue paid fines and redesigned the electrical barriers before reopening. That fall, Rachel's architecture program shared her research on responsible industrial renovation as a safety case study for future students. Regulators fined the venue and required electrical barriers before it could reopen to the public. It was September 9, 2016. In a forest clearing outside Freiburg in Germany's Black Forest, guests gathered beside a timber-framed barn for a traditional wedding ritual. Long wooden tables sat under string lights, and a reclaimed log rested across two sawhorses at the center of the clearing. At the center of the ceremony was Thomas Bauer, 28. He worked as a mechanical technician at a regional manufacturing plant, calibrating industrial cutters and maintaining safety guards on automated equipment. Co-workers described him as methodical and calm. Outside of work, he restored antique hand tools in a small workshop behind his home and occasionally hosted informal woodworking sessions for neighbors. Family members later said he often reminded people that reclaimed timber should be checked carefully before cutting because old wood can conceal hidden metal. The ritual, known as Baumstammsägen, symbolized cooperation in marriage. The couple would use a long two-person crosscut saw to cut through a log together, demonstrating teamwork in front of family and friends. The beam selected that afternoon was salvaged barn timber, dense, weathered, and decades old. Its outer surface showed age cracks and darkened grain, but no visible hardware. Witnesses later stated that Thomas briefly mentioned checking the beam for embedded nails during setup. There was no formal inspection, and no metal detector was used. The ceremony was running slightly behind schedule, and attention shifted toward keeping the guests engaged. To create a shallow starter notch and make the first pass easier for photographs, Thomas's father volunteered to use a gasoline chainsaw. The saw was a mid-range 50 cubic centimeter consumer model with a 16-inch guide bar, commonly used for firewood. It had been used earlier that week without issue. Thomas stood a few feet away, positioned to step in once the notch was complete. Several guests drifted closer to watch. His father shifted his footing slightly to the side of the beam, bent at the waist, and lowered the spinning chain into the upper surface. The cut began normally, sending a steady spray of pale wood chips outward. Approximately 2 inches into the timber, witnesses heard a sharp, metallic spark and a sudden change in pitch as the chain struck hidden metal inside the beam. The saw jerked violently upward in a split second, snapping back toward Thomas before anyone nearby could react. The guide bar snapped upward and backward. The father's grip broke as the rotating chain redirected toward Thomas. The moving chain crossed the short distance between them and struck him across the left collarbone and lower neck. Thomas fell immediately. The chainsaw was pulled away. Several people rushed forward and applied direct pressure to the wound. Blood loss was immediate and heavy. Thomas attempted to raise his right hand toward his shoulder before losing responsiveness. Emergency services were called from the clearing. First responders arrived in approximately 10 to 12 minutes. On assessment, he had no pulse and was not breathing. The volume of blood loss was already critical. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The autopsy documented a deep incised wound across the left supraclavicular region. The subclavian artery had been completely severed. Blood filled the left chest cavity, consistent with rapid exsanguination. No additional traumatic injuries were identified. Toxicology was negative. The chainsaw was examined and found mechanically functional, with no defects in the chain brake or guide assembly. Investigators later cut fully through the beam. Embedded deep within the timber was an old iron fence spike, concealed beneath layers of aged wood and oxidation. Its position matched the depth of the initial cut. Damage to the chain and witness accounts were consistent with sudden metal contact at the guide bar tip, producing the upward kickback that redirected the saw. Thomas had spent years reminding others to inspect reclaimed materials before using power tools. The salvage beam was removed from the site and retained as evidence. In the months that followed, his family converted his workshop into a small community space dedicated to tool safety awareness, preserving his restored benches and labeled instruments exactly as he had left them. It was October 18, 2014, in Greenwich, Connecticut. The Mercer estate was quiet after a late flight home. Exterior lights were on timers, the driveway heated, the garage integrated into the house's automation system. Nothing felt rushed. The danger came from a sequence that looked routine and had worked hundreds of times before. Todd and Lena Mercer were extremely wealthy. Todd, 46, was an operations manager at a hedge fund that built automated trading systems measured in milliseconds. His career rewarded trust in machines that acted faster than people. Lena, 44, managed the household full-time, overseeing staff, renovations, and schedules across multiple properties. The garage had recently been rebuilt as part of a larger smart home upgrade. New motors, new sensors, tighter climate controls meant to protect the luxury vehicles stored inside. They returned from the airport just after 11 p.m. Todd drove their SUV down the long driveway while Lena handled luggage in the back seat. The garage door had opened automatically as the car approached, triggered by a vehicle transponder mounted behind the windshield. From inside the car, the opening appeared complete. In reality, the door stopped halfway, caught by a brief sensor fault that incorrectly registered the door as fully open despite incomplete travel, sending no alert to the vehicle display. Todd assumed the door was fully open. He did not stop. The SUV entered at low speed, but struck the bottom edge of the partially lowered steel door head-on. The impact shattered the windshield and forced the door inward, collapsing its track assembly. The door dropped onto the hood as the vehicle surged forward, driven by momentum and throttle before Todd could react. The garage wall was less than 12 feet beyond the threshold. The front of the SUV slammed into the concrete wall. Airbags deployed violently. Todd absorbed the first impact through the steering wheel and dashboard, suffering massive chest trauma. Lena, seated in the front passenger seat, was thrown forward as the airbag deployed under an oblique impact that reduced its protective effectiveness. Her head struck the A-pillar before snapping back into the seat. The crumpling door and hood folded into the cabin, pinning both occupants. The house security system captured the collision on the garage camera. The sound alarm triggered automatically. A private security service called emergency responders within 30 seconds. Paramedics arrived 8 minutes later to find the vehicle crushed inside the garage, engine still running, airbags deflated, both occupants unresponsive. Todd had no pulse. Lena was breathing shallowly but lost consciousness as responders attempted extraction. Hydraulic tools were required to cut through the door and hood. Lena went into cardiac arrest during removal and could not be revived. The medical examiner reported that Todd died from blunt force trauma to the chest and internal organ rupture caused by high-energy deceleration. Lena suffered fatal head and neck injuries compounded by chest compression from the collapsing structure. Toxicology was negative. Speed was low, but the confined space and rigid wall made the crash unsurvivable. Investigators found no mechanical defect in the vehicle. System logs showed the garage door sensor briefly misreported the door as fully open during its cycle, even though it had stopped halfway. The vehicle's entry system relied on that signal alone, with no secondary visual or audible confirmation inside the car. Afterward, the Mercer estate settled quietly with vendors. The garage system was cited in safety advisories circulated among luxury home installers. The house was sold the following year. The new owners removed the automated entry entirely, replacing it with a manual control and physical stop sensors. Thanks for watching. Want to watch more? Click on your screen now.